I watched the bank manager's face shift from professional sympathy to genuine shock as I slid my phone across his desk. The video playing showed my own sister, Vanessa, using my ID at this very branch, withdrawing thousands from my accounts while I was recovering from surgery across the country. "This can't be happening," I whispered. But it was. My sister, my own flesh and blood, had systematically stolen my identity, drained my life savings of $127,000, and nearly destroyed my future. What she didn't count on was that I'd document everything, building a case so airtight that when I finally stood before a judge, justice wouldn't just be served, it would be inevitable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first suspicious charge appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing my monthly statement, a habit ingrained from years of financial discipline, when I noticed a $78.43 purchase at Nordstrom. Nothing extraordinary about that, except I hadn't been to Nordstrom in months. I made a mental note to call my bank, assuming it was simple fraud that could be quickly resolved. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and at 32, I had finally started to build the life I'd worked toward since leaving my small Midwestern hometown of Oak Ridge. I'd put myself through college, earned an MBA, and secured a position at Meridian Consulting that had recently promoted me to senior project manager. After years of careful saving, I had accumulated enough for a down payment on a modest condo in Philadelphia and was beginning to invest for retirement. I was proud of this stability, especially given where I'd started. Growing up, financial security was never a given in our household. My father left when I was 7, leaving my mother to raise 2 daughters on a teacher's salary. My sister Vanessa, 3 years younger than me, and I shared everything from bedrooms to clothes to the weight of our mother's stress. I became the responsible one almost by default, helping with bills, cooking meals when mom worked late, making sure Vanessa did her homework. While I embraced this role, Vanessa rebelled against it and against everything else. By 16, Vanessa was skipping school, hanging with a crowd that worried mom sick, and showing little interest in planning for her future. I left for college determined to build something different for myself, visiting home during breaks to find the gap between Vanessa's life choices and mine growing wider. She dropped out of community college after 1 semester, cycled through a series of retail jobs, and seemed perpetually in need of money that mysteriously never went toward rent or bills. "You're becoming such a snob," she told me during my last year of business school, when I declined to loan her $800 for what she called car repairs, but her Instagram later revealed was a weekend trip to Miami. "Just because you've got fancy degrees doesn't make you better than everyone." I didn't think I was better, just more careful with the opportunities I'd created through sacrifice and hard work. Still, her words stung. Despite our differences, she was my sister, and I wanted her to succeed. When she showed interest in photography 3 years ago, I helped her finance her first professional camera, hoping it might be the passion she needed to find direction. That camera became her most consistent possession. As her Instagram following grew, showcasing moody urban landscapes and portraits, I began to hope she'd found her path. We weren't close. Our lives had diverged too much for that. But we maintained a cordial relationship, exchanging birthday gifts and occasional texts. I invited her to holiday gatherings at my condo, and she actually showed up sometimes, complimenting my decor while subtly implying I'd become materialistic. After the Nordstrom charge, I discovered 3 more unauthorized purchases, all from stores I rarely frequented but that matched Vanessa's aesthetic. I called my bank and reported the potentially fraudulent activity, assuming my card information had been compromised somewhere. The representative assured me they would investigate and issue a new card, which should arrive within 5 to 7 business days. I thought that would be the end of it until I received a call 3 days later from my bank's fraud department. "Ms. Mitchell, we need to verify some recent activity on your account." the analyst said. Did you withdraw $3,000 from your savings account yesterday at our Center City branch? My stomach dropped. Absolutely not. I see. And did you apply for a credit line increase last week? No, I didn't. My voice had begun to shake. Ms. Mitchell, I recommend you come into a branch immediately. We're seeing patterns consistent with identity theft, not just credit card fraud. I took an early lunch break and drove to my local branch, a sense of dread building with each mile. The branch manager, Mr. Harrington, reviewed my accounts with growing concern. In the past 2 weeks, someone had withdrawn nearly $7,000 across multiple transactions, applied for credit increases on all my cards, and attempted to open a new account in my name. The concerning thing, Mr. Harrington explained, is that these were in-person transactions. The person had your ID, knew your security questions, and even signed with a reasonable approximation of your signature. I felt physically ill. Can you tell me what this person looked like? I wasn't the one who processed these transactions, but we have security footage. Given the severity, I can request access, though it might take a day or two. As I drove back to work, my mind raced through possibilities. Who would have access to my personal information, know enough about me to answer security questions, and be able to convincingly pose as me? The answer materialized before I could even finish the question. That evening, I called my mother, trying to keep my voice steady. Mom, have you heard from Vanessa lately? She came by last Sunday for dinner, seemed in good spirits for once. Said she's been getting photography work, corporate events or something. Why do you ask? Did she mention me at all? She asked how you were doing, said she was thinking of visiting you in Philly soon. Mom paused. Rebecca, what's going on? I couldn't bring myself to voice my suspicions, not yet. Just wondering. We haven't talked much lately. After hanging up, I tried calling Vanessa directly. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I texted, then messaged her on Instagram. No response. Her social media showed she'd been active that day, posting a sunset photo captioned, "New beginnings require capital investment," that now seemed ominous rather than inspirational. The next day, Mr. Harrington called. Ms. Mitchell, we have the security footage. When can you come in to review it? I arrived at the bank during my lunch break, heart pounding as Mr. Harrington led me to a small conference room where a security officer waited with a laptop. We've isolated the relevant transactions, the officer explained, queuing up the first video. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. There was Vanessa, her hair straightened to look more like mine, wearing professional attire I'd never seen her in, confidently approaching the teller. She presented an ID, my ID, and chatted casually as she completed the transaction. The timestamp showed this was just last week, while I was in Seattle for a client presentation. That's my sister, I said quietly, my voice hollow. Mr. Harrington and the security officer exchanged glances. Your sister, Mr. Harrington repeated. That complicates things. How much has she taken in total? I asked. After reviewing all my accounts, including investment accounts I hadn't thought to check, the figure was staggering. $127,438. 92. My entire life savings, the down payment I'd been accumulating for years, most of my retirement investments, all gone. We need to contact the police, the security officer said. This is felony identity theft and fraud. I nodded numbly, still staring at the frozen image of Vanessa on the screen, smiling as she pocketed what she must have known was my financial future. The process of filing a police report felt surreal. Detective Mercer, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, took my statement and copies of the bank's evidence with professional detachment. Family-based identity theft is unfortunately common, she explained, and often the most devastating. What happens now? I asked. We'll investigate, build a case, and likely make an arrest. I should warn you, though, prosecution means your sister could face serious charges. Some victims in your situation prefer to handle things privately. She took everything I've worked for, I said, my shock beginning to transform into anger. I want her held accountable. Detective Mercer nodded. Then we'll proceed. I recommend you continue gathering evidence. Document everything. Timeline of discovery, evidence of your whereabouts during the fraudulent transactions, any communication with your sister. I spent that evening creating a meticulous spreadsheet of every unauthorized transaction, cross-referenced with my own location data from my phone and work calendar. The picture it painted was methodical and opportunistic. Vanessa had begun with small purchases months ago, test runs to see if I'd notice, before escalating to major withdrawals whenever I traveled for work. As the truth solidified, pieces began falling into place. The Christmas visit where she'd excused herself to use the bathroom but was gone suspiciously long. The questions about my work schedule that I'd mistaken for genuine interest. The sudden appearance of a photography career that now seemed likely financed by my money. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying years of interactions with Vanessa, searching for the moment where sibling rivalry had transformed into something capable of this betrayal. Was it when I received my MBA while she struggled to find direction? When I purchased my condo while she still rented with multiple roommates? Or did it go back further, to childhood, when I was praised for responsibility while she was criticized for impulsivity? The next morning, bleary-eyed but resolved, I contacted my bank again to implement the strongest possible security measures on what remained of my accounts. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, changed every password, and scheduled appointments with my retirement account managers to assess the damage and begin the arduous fraud claim process. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Becca, we need to talk. It's not what you think. V." I stared at the message, a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm my carefully constructed composure. How dare she? How dare she steal my identity, drain my accounts, and then suggest there was some explanation that could possibly justify it? Before I could decide whether to respond, Detective Mercer called. "Ms. Mitchell, we've located your sister. She's in Miami, using a credit card opened in your name 3 days ago. Local authorities are preparing to make an arrest." The reality of what was happening struck me anew. My sister, the girl who'd shared my childhood bedroom, who I'd taught to ride a bike, who I'd helped with homework, was about to be arrested for stealing my identity. Part of me wanted to call it off, to find another way. But a stronger part remembered the years of sacrifice that had built my savings, the security I'd created from nothing, the future that now lay in ruins. "What do I need to do next?" I asked. Detective Mercer, my voice steadier than I expected. "Nothing right now. After the arrest, there will be an arraignment. Eventually, you'll likely need to testify. This evidence is compelling, but prosecutors' offices are overworked. Cases like these sometimes get plead down unless victims actively participate. Testify against my own sister." The thought was simultaneously heartbreaking and necessary. "I'll do whatever it takes," I told her. That evening, my mother called, her voice frantic. "Rebecca, Vanessa's been arrested, in Florida. Something about fraud. They're saying you accused her. There must be some mistake." Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I took a deep breath. "Mom, it's not a mistake. Vanessa stole my identity. She's taken almost everything I've saved." "No," Mom said immediately. "She wouldn't do that. You two have had your differences, but she's your sister. There's been a misunderstanding." The instant defense of Vanessa, without even asking for my side, stirred decades of resentment. How many times had my mother made excuses for Vanessa's behavior while expecting perfection from me? "Mom, I have her on video using my ID at my bank. She's been systematically draining my accounts for months. There's no misunderstanding." Silence, filled the line, followed by a soft sob. "Oh, Vanessa," Mom whispered. "What have you done?" The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, financial recovery attempts, and emotional exhaustion. Vanessa was extradited back to Pennsylvania to face charges. She hired a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime, paid for, I suspected bitterly, with my money. Her defense strategy became clear at the preliminary hearing. Claim I had given her permission to access my accounts to help with a photography business we were allegedly starting together. Ms. Mitchell regularly allowed her sister to use her credit cards and access her accounts, her lawyer argued smoothly. This was an arrangement between sisters that Ms. Mitchell is now misrepresenting after a personal disagreement. I sat there, stunned by the audacity of the lie. The prosecutor warned me this might happen, but seeing it unfold left me speechless. The judge, however, found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, though he set bail that Mom somehow managed to pay, despite her teacher's salary. With Vanessa released on bail, the situation grew more complicated. She returned to our hometown, staying with Mom, who called me regularly pleading for reconciliation. "She made a mistake, Rebecca. A terrible one. But she's still your sister." "A mistake is an impulsive decision you regret," I replied. "She methodically stole my identity and over $100,000. That's not a mistake. It's a calculated crime." "She says she was desperate, that she got involved with some people who threatened her if she didn't pay them. She was too ashamed to ask for help directly." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. "And you believe that?" Mom's silence was answer enough. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, I received a call from Vanessa herself. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Becca, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. If this goes to trial, I could go to prison. Is that really what you want for your own sister?" "What I wanted," I said evenly, "was not to have my identity and life savings stolen by someone I trusted. What do you think I should do, Vanessa?" "Drop the charges. We can work out a repayment plan. I'll get a job, pay you back over time." "Where is the money now?" I asked. A pause. I don't have it anymore." "You spent over $100,000 in less than 6 months?" "It's complicated," she hedged. "I had debts and investments that didn't work out." As she continued making excuses, a strange calm settled over me. This was the pattern of our entire relationship. Vanessa creating chaos, then expecting understanding, without accountability. My entire life had been shaped by being the responsible counterbalance to her impulsivity, but I didn't have to keep playing that role. "See you in court," I said, and hung up. The morning of the trial, I arrived early, dressed in a conservative navy suit, hair pulled back neatly, carrying a portfolio containing additional evidence I'd gathered, including recordings of Vanessa's calls attempting to pressure me into dropping charges. My lawyer, Ms. Patel, reviewed our strategy one final time. "The defense will attempt to paint this as a misunderstanding between sisters. They'll question why you didn't notice the fraud sooner, implying you were aware and approved of it. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself." When I entered the courtroom and saw Vanessa sitting beside her attorney, I was struck by how deliberately she'd styled herself. Modest dress, minimal makeup, hair pulled back similarly to mine. The physical resemblance between us, which had made her identity theft easier, now seemed like another manipulation meant to confuse the jury. The trial proceeded much as Ms. Patel had predicted. The prosecution presented the bank records, security, footage, and timeline of transactions. Vanessa's lawyer attempted to establish a history of financial entanglement between us, producing birthday checks I'd written her years ago and the receipt from when I'd helped her buy the camera. When my turn to testify came, I walked to the witness stand feeling the weight of my mother's presence in the gallery. I didn't look at her or at Vanessa as I was sworn in. The prosecutor led me through my discovery of the fraud, my work schedule, that placed me miles away during transactions, and the security measures I'd had in place that Vanessa had circumvented. During cross-examination, Vanessa's lawyer adopted a tone of exaggerated confusion. "Ms. Mitchell, if you and your sister were as estranged as you claim, how did she know so many details about your accounts?" "She didn't, initially," I explained. "The evidence shows she started with small transactions, likely testing what information she had access to. When I was home for Christmas, security footage from my building shows her spending 17 minutes in my home office while I was cooking dinner." The lawyer looked startled. This wasn't in the evidence he'd been provided. Ms. Patel smiled slightly beside me. "And you have this footage because I installed a security system after a break-in at a neighboring unit last year. It captures motion-activated video of all entries and movements in my condo." The defense attorney glanced at his client, who had gone noticeably pale. This was the moment I'd prepared for. The revelation I knew would dismantle her carefully. Constructed defense. "Your Honor," Ms. Patel interjected, "we have additional evidence relevant to this line of questioning that wasn't initially included because it was obtained after the discovery period." After a brief sidebar discussion, the judge allowed the new evidence. Ms. Patel played the security footage showing Vanessa methodically searching my office, photographing documents, and attempting different passwords on my computer. The courtroom fell silent. Vanessa's lawyer whispered urgently to her. My mother, when I finally glanced her way, had her face in her hands. The judge called for a 15-minute recess. When court resumed, Vanessa's lawyer requested a brief consultation with the prosecutor. They disappeared into a side room, emerging 20 minutes later. "Your Honor, we'd like to request a continuance to discuss a potential plea agreement," the prosecutor announced. The judge granted their request, scheduling a follow-up hearing for the following week. As I gathered my belongings, I finally made eye contact with Vanessa. The facade had crumbled, leaving behind something I rarely saw in her: genuine remorse, mixed with fear. Outside the courtroom, my mother approached hesitantly. "I had no idea," she said quietly. I always believed her." "I know, Mom," I replied, too emotionally drained for anger. "You always did." 1 week later, Vanessa accepted a plea deal, guilty to identity theft and fraud charges, with a sentence of 3 years, substantial restitution payments, and mandatory financial counseling. The judge, upon reviewing the case, looked directly at Vanessa during sentencing. "Family bonds are sacred trusts," he said gravely. "Your sister worked to build financial security through honest means while you chose to take what wasn't yours through deception. This court takes such violations especially seriously." Financial recovery would take years. The bank restored some funds under their fraud protection policies, but many transactions couldn't be reversed. My credit would carry the damage for years to come. The dream of homeownership had been deferred indefinitely. Yet as I left the courthouse that day, something unexpected had begun to take root: a sense of liberation. For decades, I had defined myself in opposition to Vanessa's chaos, building a life characterized by caution and control. That discipline had served me well, but it had also constrained me in ways I was only beginning to recognize. Now, forced to rebuild from scratch, I had the opportunity to redefine success on my own terms. The loss was devastating, but the strange freedom that followed would ultimately lead me toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. One where financial security remained important, but no longer served as the primary measure of my worth. As I drove home that evening, I realized that while Vanessa had taken my savings, she had inadvertently given me something else: the chance to build a life unconstrained by the patterns of our shared past, guided by my own definition of what truly constituted value. The weeks following Vanessa's sentencing passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. I had won in court, but victory felt hollow as I surveyed the wreckage of my financial life. Credit agencies needed to be contacted, fraud alerts established, accounts rebuilt from scratch. Each form I completed, each customer service representative I explained my situation to, served as a reminder of what had been taken from me. My small Philadelphia condo, once a sanctuary of achievement, now felt like a monument to vulnerability. I would sit at my kitchen counter, surrounded by financial documents, wondering how I had missed the warning signs. Had I been so focused on professional advancement that I had become blind to the threat within my own family? The thought haunted me through endless nights. Returning to work provided little relief. I had taken 2 weeks of personal leave for the trial, offering my supervisor only the vague explanation of family emergency. Upon my return, colleagues noticed my distraction, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched when my phone rang. Madison, the team lead I had once viewed as a mentor, called me into her office on my 3rd day back. "Rebecca, we need to talk about your performance," she said, her voice measured with practiced concern. "The Westridge project is falling behind schedule, and clients are asking questions I don't have answers to." I nodded, too exhausted to formulate an excuse. "I understand. I've been dealing with some personal issues, but that's no excuse for letting work slide. I'll get everything back on track this week." Madison's expression softened slightly. "Is there anything you need support with? The company has resources." "I'm fine," I interrupted, the reflexive response I had been giving everyone. "Just need to refocus." That evening, I forced myself to stay at the office until midnight, combing through the Westridge documentation, creating a recovery plan to present the next morning. The familiar rhythm of work, analyzing problems, developing solutions, executing, with precision, provided temporary distraction from the chaos of my personal life. I had always found sanctuary in professional competence, in being the reliable one who could be counted on when others faltered. That identity was too integral to who I was to surrender, even now. The recovery plan impressed Madison and temporarily quieted client concerns, but keeping pace with my normal workload while rebuilding my financial life proved unsustainable. I would arrive at the office by 7, work until 8 or 9, then return home to spend hours on hold with financial institutions, documenting transactions for restitution claims, or simply staring at spreadsheets that tracked the slow, painful process of financial reconstruction. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, both literally and figuratively. My emergency fund, what little Vanessa hadn't accessed, was dwindling rapidly as legal fees continued to mount. The restitution ordered by the court would eventually replace some of my losses, but the timeline stretched years into the future, contingent on Vanessa's ability to find employment after her release. 1 month after the trial, I received an unexpected call from my mother. We had spoken only briefly since the courthouse, our relationship strained by her initial disbelief of Vanessa's guilt and my resentment of that instinctive defense. "Rebecca," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what I can do to help. I know nothing can make up for what happened, but I want you to know I'm putting my house on the market." "What? Mom, no." "Let me finish," she said with unusual firmness. "This is my decision. The house is too big for just me anyway, and it's mostly paid off. I found a nice condo in Oak Ridge that costs half as much. The difference will go to you." Emotion tightened my throat. "Mom, you don't have to do this. It wasn't your fault." A long pause followed. "Maybe not directly," she finally said. "But I've been reflecting on how I raised you both. I expected so much from you, Rebecca. Perfect. Grades responsibility beyond your years. Emotional maturity no child should need. And Vanessa." I made excuses for her, lowered my expectations until she had none for herself. I failed you both in different ways. I sat on my couch, tears streaming silently down my face, unable to respond. my mother had never acknowledged. This imbalance before, this fundamental inequity that had shaped both Vanessa's and my development. "You don't need to accept the money," she continued, "but I hope you will. Consider it long overdue recognition of everything you've handled on your own." After we hung up, I sat motionless, processing this unexpected turn. My mother's offer represented more than financial assistance. It was acknowledgement of a lifetime of uneven expectations and opportunities for restitution that extended beyond what Vanessa had taken. I wasn't sure I was ready to accept it, but the recognition itself began healing something I hadn't realized was still wounded. The following weekend, I received another unexpected communication, an email from Vanessa. Prison regulations prohibited direct phone calls, but inmates had limited email access. I nearly deleted it unread, but curiosity overcame anger. "Rebecca," it began, "I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to. What I did was unforgivable. I've started mandatory counseling here, and my therapist encouraged me to write to you, not to ask forgiveness, but to try to explain if you're willing to hear it. I understand if you never want to speak to me again. I wouldn't blame you." I closed the email, unable to continue reading. Was this another manipulation? The start of a years-long campaign to diminish her responsibility or pave the way for early release? I couldn't risk reopening wounds that had barely begun to scab over. Yet the email lingered in my mind. 3 days later, during my lunch break, I reopened it and forced myself to read the entirety of Vanessa's message. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I existed in your shadow," she wrote. "You were always the smart one, the responsible one, the one with potential. By the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, it felt like the roles were already cast in stone. You would succeed, I would disappoint. So I leaned into it. If I was going to be the family failure anyway, I might as well embrace it, right? When I saw your financial success, it felt like final confirmation of what I'd always been told. You were better than me, more deserving. The first time I used your card was impulsive, a moment of resentment when I saw you had more in your checking account than I had made all year. I told myself you wouldn't miss it. When nothing happened, it became easier to do it again and again. I convinced myself I deserved some of what you had. After all, we came from the same family. Why should you have everything while I struggled? I know now how twisted that thinking was. It wasn't about deserve. You worked for everything you have worked harder than anyone I know. And instead of being inspired by that, I let jealousy poison me. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, whether you ever speak to me again or not." I closed my laptop, a complex tangle of emotions making it impossible to continue working. Vanessa's words contained elements I recognized as genuine. The jealousy she had barely disguised over the years, the sense of predestined roles we had both fought against and fulfilled in different ways. Yet they also displayed a level of self-awareness I had never witnessed in my sister before. Whether this represented genuine growth or calculated manipulation, I couldn't determine. I chose not to respond. Whatever journey Vanessa was on behind, bars would need to unfold without my participation, at least for now. My priority had to be rebuilding what had been lost. 2 months after the trial, I received news that the bank had agreed to restore approximately $42,000 of the stolen funds. Their fraud protection policies covered some transactions, particularly those that had occurred after I had reported the initial suspicious activity. It wasn't the full amount, but it represented a significant step toward recovery, enough to begin rebuilding my emergency fund and making minimum retirement contributions again. The partial restoration provided financial breathing room, but the psychological impact of the theft lingered. I found myself checking account balances compulsively, sometimes multiple times per day. I became hypervigilant about security, installing additional monitoring systems, creating increasingly complex passwords, and developing elaborate verification processes that even legitimate financial institutions sometimes struggled to navigate. Madison noticed my improved performance at work, but remained concerned about what she called my diminished presence. "You're meeting all your deadlines," she said during my quarterly review. "But something's missing. The creative problem-solving, the engagement in team discussions, qualities that put you on track for director-level positions seem to have disappeared." She was right. I was performing adequately, even excellently by objective measures, but mechanically. The passion that had once driven me to exceed expectations had been replaced by a grim determination to simply maintain stability. I had retreated into a defensive posture, focused on protecting what remained rather than building toward future aspirations. "I appreciate your concern," I told her, "but I'm managing my workload effectively." "That's not what I'm worried about." "Rebecca," she replied, "you've always been more than your output. I'm concerned about you." Her genuine concern cracked something in my carefully maintained composure. Before I could stop myself, the story poured out. Vanessa's betrayal, the court case, the financial devastation, the ongoing struggle to rebuild. Madison listened without interruption, her expression shifting from surprise to outrage to compassion. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "I had no idea," she finally said. "That's an extraordinary burden to carry alone." "I'm handling it," I insisted, embarrassed by my uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I don't doubt that," she said. "But you don't have to handle it in isolation." The following week, Madison connected me with the company's employee assistance program, which provided 3 free sessions with a financial counselor specializing in identity theft recovery. She also adjusted my project assignments, giving me more analytical work that played to my strengths while requiring less creative energy. These small accommodations provided space to begin healing without sacrificing professional standing. 6 months after the trial, I received notification that my mother's house had sold. True to her word, she purchased a modest condo and transferred the remaining funds, just over $112,000, into an account she had established in my name. "This doesn't make up for what happened," she wrote in the accompanying card. "But I hope it gives you back some of the security that was taken from you." The amount nearly matched what Vanessa had stolen. I stared at the balance, feeling conflicted. Accepting felt like admitting I couldn't recover on my own. Rejecting would hurt. My mother, who genuinely wanted to make amends for her role in the dynamics that had led to this situation, after careful consideration, I accepted half the amount, insisting my mother invest the remainder for her own retirement. This compromise acknowledged her desire to help while preserving my sense of self-sufficiency. It also created a foundation for rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. With financial recovery underway, I gradually began addressing the emotional aftermath. On my therapist's recommendation, I joined a support group for victims of identity theft. Most participants had been targeted by strangers, not family members, but the psychological impact, the violation of security, the loss of trust, the sense of vulnerability, resonated across our different circumstances. "The hardest part," shared Michael, a retired teacher whose identity had been stolen by a former student, "isn't the money. It's that I can't stop looking for threats everywhere. I used to see the best in people. Now I'm constantly waiting for the worst." His words articulated what I had been experiencing, a fundamental shift in how I engaged with the world. I had always been careful, but my caution had been balanced by openness to opportunity. Now potential threats overshadowed potential rewards in every interaction. "How do you move past that?" I asked the group. "How do you trust again?" Lisa, a woman in her 60s who had been dealing with the aftermath of identity theft for over 3 years, smiled gently. "You don't go back to who you were before," she said. "That person is gone. But you can become someone new, someone wiser, more discerning, but still capable of connection. The key is recognizing that hypervigilance isn't the same as wisdom. Her distinction stayed with me. In the following weeks, I began examining which of my new security measures represented genuine wisdom and which reflected trauma responses that offered the illusion of control without meaningful protection. Some practices I maintained: regular credit monitoring, careful documentation of financial transactions, limited sharing of personal information. Others I gradually relaxed, checking account balances multiple times daily, creating passwords so complex I frequently locked myself out of my own accounts, declining professional networking opportunities out of fear of vulnerability. 9 months. After the trial, I received another email from Vanessa. I had never responded to her first message, but she had continued writing monthly. I had begun reading her emails, though I still didn't reply. This one was different from previous communications. "I've been accepted into a prison education program," she wrote. "I'm going to study accounting. I know it sounds ridiculous, the last person who should be trusted with financial matters, but I'm good with numbers when I actually apply myself. My counselor thinks understanding the systems I manipulated might help me develop healthier relationships with money and responsibility. I don't expect you to care about my rehabilitation, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to build something different with whatever comes next." For the first time, I felt something beyond anger or hurt when reading Vanessa's words. Not forgiveness, that remained distant, perhaps impossible, but recognition of parallel journeys. We were both attempting to construct new identities from the wreckage of our shared history, albeit from vastly different starting points. 1 year after discovering the theft, I sat in my living room reviewing my recovery progress. Financially, I had rebuilt approximately 70% of my previous savings through a combination of my mother's contribution, bank restorations, aggressive saving, and a performance bonus Madison had championed on my behalf. My credit score, while not fully recovered, had improved significantly through consistent effort and documentation. More importantly, I had begun re-envisioning my future. The theft had forced me to examine what I was working toward, what security actually meant to me beyond numerical targets. I realized that much of my previous financial strategy had been driven by fear. Fear of repeating my childhood insecurity, fear of being unprepared for emergencies, fear of requiring assistance from others. While prudent planning remained important, I wanted my financial decisions to support aspirations rather than merely guard against catastrophe. With this shift in perspective, I made 2 significant decisions. First, I accepted a position with a smaller consulting firm specializing in nonprofit financial management. The role offered slightly lower compensation, but aligned more closely with my evolving values and provided opportunities to help organizations doing meaningful work. Second, I began exploring part-time graduate programs in financial therapy, a field combining financial planning with psychological approaches to address the emotional aspects of money management. These changes represented not just recovery, but transformation. Vanessa's betrayal had stripped away my carefully constructed security, but in rebuilding, I discovered foundations stronger than what had existed before, ones based on genuine values rather than reactive patterns established in childhood. As I reviewed my new financial plan, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Thinking of visiting Philadelphia next month. Would love to see your place if you're comfortable with that." I smiled, recognizing the careful consideration behind her wording. We were both learning new ways to relate, establishing boundaries while maintaining connection. I texted back, "I'd like that. Let me know your dates." Recovery wasn't a destination I would ever fully reach, I realized. It was an ongoing process of reclaiming what had been taken, not just financial assets, but trust, security, and the capacity to move forward without being defined by betrayal. The journey would continue, with setbacks and progress existing, side by side, but I was no longer simply surviving the aftermath. I was building something new from what remained. 18 months after the trial, I stood in the doorway of my new office at Horizon Nonprofit Consulting, watching as the morning light filtered through recently installed blinds. The space was modest compared to my former corner workspace at Meridian, but what it lacked in corporate prestige, it made up for in purpose. Photographs of client organizations lined the walls, a community health clinic providing care to underserved neighborhoods, an educational foundation helping first-generation college students navigate financial aid, a microlending program supporting women entrepreneurs. Each image represented not just a consulting contract, but a mission I had become invested in beyond balance sheets and financial projections. My career transition had not been without challenges. Taking a 20% salary reduction while still rebuilding savings required adjustments to my lifestyle and expectations. Yet the trade-offs had proven worthwhile, as I discovered that applying my financial expertise to organizations creating tangible social impact generated satisfaction that no year-end bonus at Meridian had ever provided. Jennifer, the firm's founder and managing partner, appeared in my doorway with 2 coffee cups, handing one to me as she leaned against the frame. "Ready for the community action presentation this afternoon?" she asked, taking a sip from her. "Ugh." I nodded, gesturing toward the meticulously prepared slides on my computer screen. Their grant application is solid, but they're underestimating administrative costs by about 15%. I've developed 3 budget scenarios that would make the project sustainable without compromising core services. Jennifer smiled. "This is why we poached you from Meridian. You see beyond the numbers to the people they impact." Her statement caught me off guard. Throughout my career, I had prided myself on analytical precision, on being the person who understood financial systems with mathematical exactitude. The suggestion that my value lay equally in translating those numbers into human outcomes represented a fundamental shift in how others perceived my contributions, and perhaps more significantly, how I had begun to view my own work. That afternoon, as I guided the Community Action Leadership Team through sustainable funding models, I found myself sharing not just projections and contingency plans, but also stories from similar organizations I had consulted with, the challenges they had overcome, the creative solutions they had implemented, the communities that had benefited from their persistence. Financial resilience isn't just about having adequate reserves, I explained, moving beyond the technical analysis I would have limited myself to previously. It's about building systems that can absorb unexpected setbacks while maintaining your core mission. The goal isn't perfect financial stability. That's rarely possible in nonprofit work. It's developing the capacity to adapt without abandoning the people who depend on your services. As the words left my mouth, I recognized that I was articulating lessons from my own recovery journey. The theft had shattered my illusion of perfect security, forcing me to develop resilience rather than simply rebuilding rigid protective structures. The parallel between my personal experience and the guidance I now offered professionally wasn't coincidental. It represented genuine wisdom earned through adversity. The Community Action Team left with renewed confidence in their mission and practical tools to strengthen their financial foundation. As I packed up my presentation materials, the organization's executive director, a woman who had founded the nonprofit after experiencing homelessness herself, paused to thank me. "Most financial consultants treat us like we're fiscally irresponsible. Dreamers," she said. "You treated us like partners working towards something important. That makes all the difference." Her words stayed with me during my evening commute to the small townhouse I had purchased 3 months earlier. The property was further from Center City than my former condo, in a neighborhood undergoing revitalization rather than one already established. What it lacked in prestige, it made up for in character and community, attributes I had come to value more than the external markers of success that had once defined my goals. My mother had visited shortly after I moved in, helping transform the space from an empty shell into a home. Our relationship had evolved significantly over the past year, developing into something more authentic than the dutiful daughter, successful parent dynamic that had characterized our interactions for decades. We spoke more honestly now, acknowledging past patterns without becoming trapped in recrimination. Her willingness to examine her role in establishing the family system that had contributed to Vanessa's behavior and my corresponding hyper-responsibility had opened pathways for genuine connection. As I prepared dinner that evening, my phone notified me of an incoming email from Vanessa. Despite never responding to her messages, I had continued reading them, watching from a distance as she documented her education progress, therapy insights, and gradual acceptance of responsibility. Today's communication was different. I received notice that I'm being considered for early release based on program completion and behavioral assessment, she wrote. The parole board will review my case next month. If approved, I would transfer to a halfway house in Philadelphia to complete my sentence. I wanted you to hear this from me rather than being surprised. I understand if my proximity would be unwelcome. I can request placement in another district if that would make you more comfortable. I set down my phone, my appetite suddenly diminished. The possibility of Vanessa's physical presence in my city created complicated emotions. She had served less than half of her 3-year sentence. Was that sufficient consequence for the magnitude of her betrayal? Yet the consideration shown in offering to request alternative placement suggested continued growth in her understanding of healthy boundaries, a concept that had been notably absent in our family dynamics. I didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to process the information with my therapist during our regular session the following day. What concerns you most about Vanessa potentially being in Philadelphia? Dr. Winters asked after I explained the situation. I considered the question carefully. I'm not afraid she would try to steal from me again. The monitoring systems in place would make that nearly impossible, and she seems genuinely committed to her rehabilitation. So what is it then? I think? I paused, searching for words to articulate the vague discomfort. I think I'm afraid of being pulled back into our old patterns, the responsible sister and the chaotic one, the achiever and the struggling one, being her keeper somehow. Dr. Winters nodded. That concern shows significant self-awareness. You recognize it's not about what Vanessa might do, but about the dynamic you might revert to. She's my sister, I said quietly. Despite everything, that remains true. I don't want a relationship built on resentment, but I'm not sure I know how to build one based on anything else. Perhaps the question isn't whether you want her in your city, but what boundaries would need to be in place for you to feel secure in your separate identity if she were. I spent the next week reflecting on this framework, identifying specific boundaries that would protect my recovery while potentially allowing for some form of restructured relationship. After careful consideration, I composed my first direct response to Vanessa since before the trial. I won't oppose your placement in Philadelphia, I wrote. However, I need to be clear about my boundaries. I'm not in a position to offer housing, financial assistance, or regular in-person contact initially. If you're serious about rebuilding trust, that will require consistent demonstration of responsibility and respect for these limits. I'm willing to consider communication through a family therapist if that becomes appropriate in the future. Her response came quickly. Thank you for your honesty. I respect your boundaries completely and expect nothing from you. The opportunity to potentially make amends someday is more than I deserve. The exchange, while brief, represented a significant shift from the entitlement that had characterized Vanessa's previous attitude toward my resources. Whether this change reflected genuine transformation or calculated self-presentation remained to be determined, but establishing clear parameters provided protection regardless of her intentions. 3 weeks later, I received notification that Vanessa's early release had been approved, with transfer to a Philadelphia halfway house scheduled for the following month. The facility was across the city from my neighborhood, requiring intentional effort for any contact to occur, a geographic boundary that provided additional security. Meanwhile, my professional trajectory continued its positive evolution. Jennifer had begun involving me in the firm's strategic planning, valuing my unique perspective as someone who had navigated both corporate and nonprofit financial environments. The blend of analytical rigor and mission orientation I brought to client engagements had attracted attention beyond our immediate client base, leading to speaking invitations at regional nonprofit conferences. My first major presentation, focused on financial resilience strategies for community organizations, drew an unexpectedly large audience. As I surveyed the room of nonprofit leaders, board members, and funders, I recognized an opportunity to transform my personal experience into broadly applicable insights. Financial security isn't what most of us imagine, I began, departing from my prepared opening. We think of it as an achievement, a fixed state we reach through careful planning and disciplined execution. In reality, true financial resilience isn't about achieving perfect stability, but developing the capacity to recover from disruption while maintaining core values and purpose. The audience's engagement was immediate and sustained as I shared frameworks for risk assessment, adaptive planning, and resource diversification. Without disclosing the specific circumstances of my own financial devastation, I wove in principles I had discovered through rebuilding, the importance of identifying what truly matters beyond numerical targets, the distinction between prudent protection and fear-based restriction, the necessity of community support during recovery. The organizations that survive long-term aren't those that avoid all financial challenges, I concluded. They're the ones that develop recovery muscles through smaller disruptions, creating institutional knowledge that serves them when facing larger obstacles. Financial resilience isn't the absence of setbacks. It's the presence of responsive, values-aligned recovery capacity. The standing ovation that followed was unexpected and deeply affirming. As attendees approached afterward with questions and appreciation, I realized I had found a voice beyond technical expertise, one that integrated professional knowledge with hard-earned personal wisdom. Several organizations requested proposals for consulting projects, and 2 foundation representatives expressed interest in funding a workshop series based on the resilience framework I had presented. That evening, Jennifer invited me to dinner to discuss the presentation's success and its implications for my role at the firm. "What you shared today resonated because it was authentic," she said, as we settled into a quiet corner table at her favorite restaurant. "You've experienced financial devastation and rebuilding firsthand. That perspective is uniquely valuable, especially to organizations navigating uncertainty." I tensed slightly, wondering how much she knew about the specific circumstances of my financial loss. I had been intentionally vague about the details when transitioning from Meridian. Noticing my reaction, Jennifer continued, "I don't need to know the particulars of what happened. What matters is that you've transformed that experience into insight that helps others. I'm proposing we develop a specialized service line focused on organizational resilience, with you taking the lead." The opportunity represented professional recognition I hadn't anticipated achieving so quickly after leaving Meridian. More significantly, it offered a platform to facilitate for organizations the same transformation I had undergone personally, moving from rigid security to adaptive resilience, from fear-based protection to values-aligned strength. "I'd be honored," I replied. As we discussed implementation details, I found myself sharing more openly about my journey than I had intended, though still without specifying that my sister had been the source of the theft. The hardest lesson, I admitted, was recognizing that my previous approach to financial security was primarily about control rather than genuine well-being. I was so focused on preventing negative outcomes that I limited positive possibilities. The loss forced me to distinguish between what I truly valued and what I was pursuing out of fear. Jennifer nodded. That insight alone is worth sharing with our clients. So many organizations operate from scarcity mindsets that actually inhibit their mission fulfillment. By the time we finished dinner, We had outlined a comprehensive program combining workshops, assessment tools, and targeted consulting interventions designed to help mission-driven organizations develop financial resilience while expanding impact. The week Vanessa transferred to the halfway house coincided with my beginning work on this new initiative. The parallelism wasn't lost on me. As I developed resources to help others transform setbacks into sources of strength, my sister was attempting her own reconstruction within the constraints of her circumstances. I received notification of her arrival in Philadelphia through the Victim Services Office rather than direct communication, a boundary Vanessa appeared to be respecting. According to the update, she had secured entry-level employment at an accounting firm that specifically hired individuals with criminal records, providing supervised experience while they rebuilt their lives. Her parole conditions included regular financial monitoring, continued counseling, and strict adherence to restitution payment schedules. 2 months into her halfway house placement, without any attempted contact from her, I made a decision that surprised even me. After consulting with Dr. Winters about the potential risks and benefits, I reached out to the family therapist she had recommended, inquiring about the possibility of facilitated communication with Vanessa. Dr. Marshall, a specialist in family systems affected by financial breach of trust, proposed a structured approach beginning with separate sessions to establish individual goals and boundaries before any joint meetings. This measured process provided the security I needed to consider rebuilding some form of relationship without risking re-traumatization or returning to dysfunctional patterns. My first session with Dr. Marshall focused on clarifying my motivations and expectations. I don't want reconciliation if that means pretending what happened wasn't devastating, I explained. But I also don't want to be defined by victimhood permanently. There must be some middle path between forgiveness that erases accountability and resentment that ties me to the betrayal indefinitely. Dr. Marshall nodded. That middle path exists, but it's not a destination as much as an ongoing process. The question becomes not whether you can trust Vanessa completely again, but whether limited, boundaried interaction serves your well-being and values. What would a relationship that honors both the reality of what happened and the possibility of mutual growth look like? This framework, focusing on my well-being rather than Vanessa's redemption, shifted my perspective significantly. I began envisioning a potential relationship based not on familial obligation or shared history, but on conscious choice and clear boundaries. Such a relationship would require ongoing demonstration of changed behavior from Vanessa and continued self-protection on my part, but it might provide liberation from the emotional weight of permanent estrangement. After 3 individual sessions, Dr. Marshall facilitated a limited written exchange, a structured format that allowed for reflection before response and maintained appropriate distance while establishing new communication patterns. Vanessa's initial letter acknowledged the harm she had caused without expectation of forgiveness, articulated her ongoing rehabilitation efforts, and expressed willingness to engage on whatever terms I deemed acceptable. My response outlined specific behaviors that would demonstrate meaningful change: consistent employment, full compliance with restitution requirements, respect for stated boundaries, and continued personal development work. I made clear that any potential relationship would develop gradually, if at all, based on sustained actions rather than promises or apologies. This measured approach provided unexpected benefits. By focusing on observable behavior rather than emotional reconciliation, I established a framework that protected my recovery while allowing for the possibility of eventual healing. The process itself reinforced my agency. I was no longer simply responding to betrayal, but actively defining the conditions under which I might engage with someone who had harmed me. 2 years after discovering the theft that had shattered my financial security and familial trust, I stood in my office at Horizon, reviewing the resilience framework that had emerged from my experience and now guided our work with dozens of organizations. On my desk sat the latest restitution payment notification, a modest sum transferred monthly from Vanessa's earnings steadily rebuilding what had been taken. The amount mattered less than the consistency, the tangible evidence of follow-through that had been absent in previous patterns. My phone chimed with a calendar notification for an upcoming presentation to the Regional Association of Community Foundations. The subject, From Disruption to Development, Building Organizational Recovery Capacity, reflected the transformation I had undergone personally and now facilitated professionally. The journey from victim to guide, from devastation to purposeful rebuilding, had not erased the harm done but had integrated it into a stronger, more authentic identity than the one that had existed before. Financial security remained important, but it no longer served as my primary measure of success or source of safety. The true security I had discovered lay in resilience, the capacity to maintain core values while adapting to unexpected challenges, to rebuild with greater wisdom after loss, and to transform painful experience into meaningful contribution. As I gathered my materials for a client meeting, I glanced at the small framed quote on my wall, words I had discovered during the darkest period of my recovery. Resilience is not about returning to what was, but growing into what can be. The theft had taken my savings, but the reconstruction had given me something more valuable, a life aligned with authentic purpose rather than external expectations, and the capacity to help others navigate their own journeys from loss to renewed meaning. 3 years after the discovery of Vanessa's betrayal, I stood at the podium of the National Conference for Community Development Organizations, surveying an audience of nearly 500 nonprofit leaders, financial professionals, and foundation representatives. My keynote address, Transforming Financial Trauma into Mission Resilience, represented the culmination of work that had evolved from personal recovery into a recognized methodology for organizational strength. Financial setbacks can either become defining limitations or catalysts for transformation, I began, my voice steady with a confidence that had been hard-won. The determining factor isn't the magnitude of the loss, but our relationship to reconstruction. Do we merely rebuild what existed before, or do we use the opportunity to create something more aligned with our core purpose? As I guided the audience, through principles of adaptive resilience, I observed nodding heads and furious note-taking. These concepts resonated because they addressed a fundamental truth about both personal and organizational development: that our greatest vulnerabilities, when consciously addressed, often become the foundation for our most significant contributions. The professional trajectory that had brought me to this podium would have been unimaginable during those dark months after discovering my sister's theft. Horizon Nonprofit Consulting had expanded the resilience-focused services I had developed into a specialized division serving organizations nationwide. My role had evolved from consultant to director of resilience services, with a team of 6 professionals implementing the frameworks I had created. Jennifer, now approaching retirement, had begun discussions about succession planning for the firm, mentioning my name as a potential managing partner. The possibility both honored and challenged me, representing professional recognition beyond anything I had aspired to previously, along with responsibilities that would test my leadership capacity in new ways. Following the keynote, I participated in a panel discussion with foundation directors who had implemented resilience-focused funding approaches based partly on our work. As the conversation turned to transformative recovery experiences, Angela Reeves, Executive Director of the Westfield Community Foundation, shared her organization's journey following the discovery of significant financial mismanagement by a trusted administrator. We initially focused exclusively on strengthening control systems, she explained. More authorizations, stricter oversight, compartmentalized access. Those changes were necessary but insufficient. What truly transformed our organization was rebuilding with purpose at the center rather than protection. Rebecca's framework helped us distinguish between security measures that enable mission fulfillment and those that primarily serve psychological reassurance. Her distinction perfectly articulated the insight at the core of my approach: The understanding that excessive protective measures often constrain the very purpose they intend to safeguard. This principle had emerged directly from my personal journey, where I had discovered that hypervigilance, while creating an illusion of control, ultimately limited growth and connection. After the conference concluded, I returned to my hotel room to prepare for an appointment I had scheduled with intentional symmetry. Later that evening, in a carefully selected neutral location, a private meeting room at a community center equidistant from my home and Vanessa's halfway house, I would have my first face-to-face conversation with my sister since her sentencing. The decision to establish direct communication had evolved gradually through the facilitated process with Dr. Marshall. For 6 months, we had engaged in structured written exchanges, progressing to occasional video conferences with the therapist present. Throughout this measured reintroduction, Vanessa had demonstrated consistent respect for my boundaries, acknowledgement of the harm she had caused, and tangible evidence of her rehabilitation efforts. She had maintained steady employment at the accounting firm, received positive performance reviews, and completed additional certification courses. Her restitution payments, while modest relative to the total amount taken, arrived without fail each month. Most significantly, she had refrained from making demands or expectations, accepting that rebuilding trust would require sustained demonstration of changed behavior, rather than declarations of remorse. As I reviewed my notes for our meeting, I reflected on the careful preparation Dr. Marshall had facilitated. We had established clear parameters, a 60-minute conversation focused on present circumstances rather than past grievances, with specific topics identified in advance, and the understanding that either of us could end the interaction if boundaries were crossed. These guidelines provided the security necessary for me to consider this step without compromising my recovery. At precisely 7 o'clock, I entered the meeting room to find Vanessa already seated, hands folded neatly on the table before her. The physical similarities between us remained evident, the same blue eyes and high cheekbones that had made her impersonation possible. But her presentation had changed dramatically. Gone was the carefully cultivated bohemian aesthetic she had maintained throughout her 20s, replaced by simple, practical attire that suggested functionality rather than self-expression. Her hair, once styled to attract attention, was now pulled back in a simple knot, revealing a face that appeared simultaneously older and more present than I remembered. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said quietly as I took my seat across from her. The 6 feet of table between us represented an appropriate physical manifestation of our current relationship, connected but distinctly separate, with clear boundaries maintained. "I appreciate your respecting the parameters we discussed," I replied, my tone professional rather than familial. An awkward silence followed, the weight of our history filling the space between carefully crafted opening statements. Dr. Marshall had prepared us for this moment, encouraging us to acknowledge the discomfort rather than rushing to eliminate it. "This feels strange," Vanessa finally said. "Necessary, but strange." I nodded. "Yes. I've thought about what I would say if we ever had this conversation," she continued, maintaining appropriate eye contact without staring. "Practiced apologies, explanations, assurances. None of them seem adequate." "They wouldn't be," I confirmed, my directness not unkind but clear. "What happened can't be addressed through conversation alone." "I know." She straightened slightly. "That's why I've tried to focus on demonstrating change through actions. I've completed the financial ethics certification program my counselor recommended, and my supervisor has approved me to begin working with clients under guidance. The firm specializes in financial recovery planning for individuals rebuilding after setbacks. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that Vanessa's path toward redemption involved helping others navigate financial challenges similar to what she had created for me. Yet there was potential meaning in this symmetry, the possibility that genuine atonement might include transforming harm done into service rendered. "Tell me about your recovery work," I said, selecting one of the topics we had agreed might form constructive conversation. For the next 30 minutes, Vanessa described her ongoing rehabilitation process with a self-awareness that would have been unrecognizable in her former self. She discussed the therapeutic work that had helped her identify the entitlement and jealousy underlying her actions, the accountability structures she had established to support continued growth, and the amends projects she had undertaken beyond court-mandated restitution. "The most important thing I've learned," she said toward the end of this overview, "is that true redemption isn't about escaping consequences or being forgiven. It's about becoming someone who would never again make the choices I made, someone who contributes to others' well-being rather than exploiting their trust." This perspective aligned with my own evolving understanding of recovery, that meaningful transformation involves not erasing past harms, but integrating them into a more conscious identity capable of greater integrity. Whether Vanessa's insight represented genuine growth or strategic self-presentation remained to be fully determined through sustained action over time, but the possibility of authentic change existed in a way I hadn't previously considered. As our scheduled time drew to a close, I shared briefly about my professional work, describing the resilience framework I had developed without explicitly connecting it to her actions. The parallels were evident without elaboration. How devastating. Breach had ultimately led to purposeful contribution. How protection had evolved into adaptation. "I'm genuinely impressed by what you've created," Vanessa said, her tone thoughtful rather than effusive. "Not surprised, but impressed. You always had the capacity to turn challenges into opportunities. I just never expected to be the cause of such a significant challenge." "Neither did I replied, allowing a small smile to acknowledge the understatement. We concluded the meeting with tentative plans for another conversation in 3 months, maintaining the structured approach, while gradually establishing direct communication. As we prepared to leave, Vanessa hesitated briefly. "Rebecca, I want to be clear about something. I'm not expecting our relationship to ever return to what it was, or what it might have been in some idealized version of sisterhood. What I did fundamentally altered what's possible between us. I'm grateful for whatever limited connection you're willing to consider, with the understanding that it will always include appropriate distance and boundaries." Her acknowledgement of this reality, that actions have permanent consequences even amid rehabilitation, represented perhaps the most significant evidence of growth. The former Vanessa had lived in a world where charm and manipulation could erase responsibility. This version appeared to understand the irreversible nature of certain choices. "Thank you for recognizing that," I said simply. The following week, I met with Jennifer to discuss the succession planning process she had initiated for Horizon. Over lunch at our regular bistro, she outlined her vision for the firm's future and her assessment of my potential role in it. "The board and I believe you bring exactly what Horizon needs for its next chapter," she explained. "Technical excellence combined with mission alignment, innovative thinking balanced with practical implementation skills. Most importantly, you understand that financial resilience and impact aren't competing priorities but complementary strengths." I considered her words carefully, recognizing the significant responsibility they represented. "I'm honored by your confidence. Before making any decisions, I'd like to understand more about your timeline and expectations. Taking on a managing partner role would represent a substantial shift from my current client-focused work." Jennifer nodded appreciatively. "That measured response is precisely why you're right for this. You don't rush decisions based on ego or external validation. Take whatever time you need to consider. The succession process will unfold over 18 to 24 months, giving us ample opportunity to determine if this direction serves both your goals and the organization's needs." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my professional aspirations had evolved since the theft. Before Vanessa's betrayal, my definition of success had been firmly anchored in conventional metrics: salary increases, title advancements, recognition within established hierarchies. The prospect of partnership at Meridian had represented the pinnacle of those aspirations, promising financial security and professional status. The managing partner opportunity at Horizon offered something fundamentally different: the chance to shape an organization whose work directly strengthened community resilience, whose values aligned with my authentic purpose, whose impact extended beyond financial performance to meaningful contribution. This evolution in what I valued professionally paralleled my personal transformation, both reflecting a shift from security-focused achievement to purpose-driven engagement. The following weekend, my mother visited Philadelphia for our now regular quarterly get-together. Our relationship had developed into something neither of us could have anticipated 3 years earlier: a balanced adult connection based on mutual respect rather than role-defined interactions. She had relocated to a smaller community near Oak Ridge after selling the family home, developing new friendships and interests that had expanded her identity beyond parenthood. As we walked through Fairmount Park enjoying the early spring weather, she updated me on her recent activities: a watercolor class she had begun taking, volunteer work with a literacy program, tentative steps into dating for the first time since my father's departure decades earlier. I never expected to discover so many new aspects of myself at this stage of life, she admitted. For so long, my identity was completely wrapped up in being your mother, trying to ensure you had opportunities I hadn't, worrying about Vanessa's choices, compensating for your father's absence. There's something liberating about relating to you both as adults with separate lives. Her observation highlighted another unexpected outcome of the painful reconstruction period: that the disruption of established family patterns had created space for each of us to develop more authentic identities. The crisis had forced a reconfiguration of relationships that, while traumatic in execution, had ultimately facilitated growth that might otherwise have remained inaccessible. "Have you decided whether you'll attend Vanessa's transition ceremony?" my mother asked carefully, referring to the halfway house's formal recognition of residents completing their program requirements. "I'm still considering it," I replied honestly. We've had 3 structured meetings now, each progressively more productive. The therapist believes occasional family connection supports her rehabilitation, provided appropriate boundaries remain in place. I've made clear that my presence wouldn't indicate complete reconciliation, but acknowledgement of her efforts towards genuine change. My mother nodded, respecting my measured approach. "Your willingness to consider any form of relationship shows tremendous strength. Many people would maintain absolute separation after such a betrayal." "It's not about forgiveness, in the conventional sense," I explained. "It's about not allowing the harm done to determine all future possibilities. Maintaining permanent estrangement would keep me tethered to the betrayal in a different way than cautious reconnection does." This insight had emerged gradually through my therapeutic work, the understanding that both unconditional forgiveness and absolute estrangement represented forms of continued definition by past trauma. The middle path I was attempting offered the possibility of integration without erasure, of moving forward without denying what had occurred. 4 years after discovering Vanessa's theft, I sat in my office at Horizon reviewing the quarterly assessment of our Resilience Services division. The program had expanded beyond my initial vision, now including targeted interventions for organizations at different stages of development, comprehensive training for boards and leadership teams, and research partnerships documenting the impact of resilience-focused approaches on mission fulfillment. The financial restitution process had progressed steadily, with approximately 40% of the stolen funds recovered through a combination of court-ordered payments, bank restorations, and insurance claims. While complete financial recovery remained distant, the momentum toward restoration continued, much like the gradual rebuilding of conditional trust with my sister, through consistent demonstration of changed behavior. As I prepared for a meeting to discuss Horizon's strategic planning process, I noticed an email from the conference organizer where I had delivered the keynote address 3 months earlier. The message included feedback from attendees, with multiple comments highlighting how the resilience framework had already influenced their organization's approaches to financial management and mission fulfillment. Your presentation fundamentally shifted our perspective on recovery from financial setbacks, wrote the executive director of a rural development organization. We've implemented the adaptive resilience assessment tools you provided and discovered that our strongest programs were precisely those that had previously experienced and overcome funding challenges. This insight has transformed how we approach risk and opportunity across our entire operation. Reading these responses, I felt a profound sense of integration, of personal trauma transformed into professional wisdom, of private recovery converted to public contribution. The theft that had nearly destroyed my financial foundation had ultimately led to the development of frameworks that now strengthened dozens of organizations serving thousands of community members. This evolution represented the most meaningful outcome of the reconstruction process, not just rebuilding what had been taken, but creating something of greater value and impact than what had existed before. The path from victim to survivor to guide had unfolded not through denial of the harm done, but through its conscious incorporation into a more purposeful identity. As I closed my laptop and prepared to join the strategic planning meeting where we would discuss Horizon's future direction, including my potential leadership role, I reflected on the journey of the past 4 years. The financial security I had, once pursued as an end in itself, had been revealed as merely a means toward more meaningful engagement. The professional success I had defined in conventional terms had evolved into contribution aligned with authentic purpose. Most importantly, I had discovered that true resilience emerges not from avoiding vulnerability, but from transforming it, from allowing painful experience to expand rather than contract our capacity for meaningful connection and contribution. This understanding now informed every aspect of my life, from professional decisions to family relationships to personal goals, creating an integrated foundation stronger than what had existed before the betrayal that had initially appeared to destroy everything. 5 years after discovering Vanessa's betrayal, I stood at the entrance of Horizon Nonprofit Consulting's newly expanded offices, watching as staff members arranged furniture and technology in preparation for our official reopening celebration. The renovated space, twice the size of our previous location, featured dedicated training facilities, collaborative workspaces, and environmentally sustainable design elements that reflected the firm's evolving values and growing influence. As managing partner, a position I had assumed 6 months earlier following Jennifer's retirement, I had overseen both the physical expansion and the strategic repositioning that necessitated it. Under my leadership, Horizon had shifted from primarily offering technical financial consulting to providing comprehensive resilience-building services across multiple dimensions of organizational health. This evolution had attracted significant foundation investment, expanded our client base nationally, and necessitated doubling our professional staff. "Everything's on schedule for tomorrow's event," confirmed Alicia, our operations director, joining me at the entrance. The mayor's office confirmed attendance, along with representatives from 14 foundation partners and over 30 client organizations. I nodded, surveying the space with a blend of pride and responsibility. "The community panel discussion is finalized?" "Yes. 3 executive directors from organizations that implemented your resilience framework, plus 2 foundation directors who've adopted it as a funding criterion. Perfect demonstration of the impact continuum." The impact continuum, from individual organization to funding ecosystem to community outcomes, represented the most significant evolution in my professional approach. Rather than working with nonprofits in isolation, we had developed methodologies for strengthening entire sectors through aligned resilience practices, creating multiplier effects that benefited communities far beyond our direct client engagements. This systems-level perspective had emerged directly from my personal recovery journey. where I had discovered that genuine resilience develops not through individual fortitude alone, but through the interconnected strength of supportive networks. What had begun as painful reconstruction after devastating betrayal had evolved into a comprehensive methodology for transforming vulnerability into collaborative strength across entire communities. As I returned to my office to review my remarks for tomorrow's event, I noticed an email from Dr. Marshall, the family therapist who had facilitated the gradual redevelopment of limited communication with Vanessa. The subject line, "Important Update," prompted immediate attention. "Rebecca," the message began, "Vanessa has asked me to inform you that she has received a job offer from Collins Financial Recovery in Seattle. This represents a significant professional advancement opportunity, as the firm specializes in helping identity theft victims rebuild financial security, expertise she has developed through her rehabilitation process. She is considering accepting the position, but wanted you to know before making her decision, as geographical distance would impact the carefully structured contact you have established. She has emphasized that she will decline the offer if you believe her relocation would be perceived as attempting to escape ongoing accountability." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing this unexpected development. After completing her halfway house program, Vanessa had maintained residence in Philadelphia, living in a modest apartment and continuing her work with the accounting firm that specialized in rehabilitation employment. During the past year, we had established a carefully calibrated relationship, monthly conversations over coffee in public settings, occasional attendance at the same family gatherings, and clearly defined boundaries regarding financial information and personal resources. This measured reconnection had proven surprisingly beneficial, providing resolution without denial of what had occurred. Vanessa had maintained consistent demonstration of changed behavior, continuing restitution payments, respecting established boundaries, pursuing professional development focused on helping others avoid or recover from financial exploitation. While complete trust would never be possible, a functional relationship based on present actions rather than past expectations had gradually emerged. Her potential relocation represented both challenge and opportunity, threatening the stability of current arrangements while possibly offering chance for further evolution in my own recovery journey. Would geographical distance represent abandonment of accountability or appropriate independent development? Would my response be based on legitimate boundary maintenance or unconscious desire for continued proximity-based control? I closed the email without immediately responding, recognizing the importance of distinguishing between reactive emotion and considered assessment. This distinction, between immediate defensive responses and thoughtful evaluation based on core values, had become central to my approach in both personal and professional contexts. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner in my townhouse kitchen, I received an unexpected call from my mother. "I just heard from Vanessa about the job opportunity," she said after brief pleasantries. "She wanted me to know before deciding, but asked that I not influence your response." I smiled slightly at this evidence of my sister's continued commitment to appropriate boundaries, informing our mother while explicitly discouraging triangulation that might pressure my decision. "What are your thoughts?" I asked, genuinely interested in my mother's perspective, which had evolved considerably over the past 5 years. "I think it's a complex situation," she replied thoughtfully. "The position sounds perfectly aligned. With her rehabilitation focus, using her understanding of financial exploitation to help others recover. That seems meaningful rather than exploitative. At the same time, I understand how her leaving Philadelphia might raise concerns about commitment to continued accountability." Her balanced assessment reflected the growth she had demonstrated throughout the reconstruction period, developing capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without defaulting to protective simplification of complex family dynamics. "What I've realized," she continued, "is that my role isn't to manage the relationship between my adult daughters, but to support each of you in making decisions aligned with your own well-being and values. Whatever you decide regarding Vanessa's move, I'll respect your boundaries while maintaining appropriate connection with both of you." This perspective, honoring independence while offering support, represented significant evolution from the enmeshed family patterns that had characterized our earlier relationships. The crisis had ultimately facilitated healthier differentiation for all of us, enabling more authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than unconscious role fulfillment. After our conversation concluded, I reviewed the documentation of my 5-year recovery journey. Financial records showing steady rebuilding of savings and investments, professional achievements reflecting transition from survival to contribution, therapeutic notes tracking evolution from traumatic reactivity to integrated resilience. This comprehensive assessment provided context for evaluating Vanessa's potential relocation within the broader trajectory of my post-betrayal development. The following morning, before the office reopening celebration, I met with my own therapist, Dr. Winters, to discuss the situation. "What concerns you most about Vanessa potentially moving to Seattle?" she asked after I outlined the circumstances. I considered this question carefully. 5 years ago, I would have automatically assumed she was attempting to escape accountability. Now, I recognize that interpretation reflects my past experience rather than current evidence. Her behavior during the rehabilitation process has consistently demonstrated commitment to responsibility. What other perspectives might be relevant? The position genuinely aligns with her developing expertise in helping identity theft victims. There's potentially meaningful symmetry in her using understanding of harm caused to prevent similar damage to others. And from a purely practical standpoint, Seattle's cost of living would make continued restitution payments more challenging, which she has acknowledged in discussions with Dr. Marshall. Dr. Winters nodded. "You're considering multiple dimensions rather than defaulting to protection-based interpretation. What would support your continued recovery regardless of her geographical location?" This framing, focusing on my well-being independent of Vanessa's choices, resonated strongly. My recovery journey had evolved from reactive self-protection to proactive self-definition, from healing dependent on others' behavior to integrated resilience based on internal resources and chosen connections. Clear communication protocols. I replied, "Continued financial transparency through the restitution management system, perhaps quarterly video conversations rather than monthly in-person meetings. Most importantly, my ongoing development of security not defined by external control but by internal integration." That perspective reflects significant growth, Dr. Winters observed. "You're approaching this decision from a position of strength, rather than vulnerability, considering implications for both your continued recovery and Vanessa's rehabilitation progress." That afternoon, as community leaders, foundation representatives, and client organizations gathered to celebrate Horizon's expansion, I delivered remarks that connected our organizational evolution to broader principles of transformative resilience. True resilience isn't about returning to previous states after disruption, I explained to the assembled guests. It's about integrating challenging experiences into more adaptive, purposeful systems. The organizations represented here today haven't merely survived financial setbacks. They've transformed those experiences into stronger mission delivery, more collaborative partnerships, and greater community impact. As I surveyed the gathering, nonprofit leaders whose organizations had implemented resilience frameworks developed from my personal recovery methodology, foundation directors who had adopted these approaches as funding criteria, community members benefiting from strengthened services, I experienced profound integration of personal and professional purpose. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy my future had ultimately become the foundation for contributions extending far beyond my individual circumstances. Following the event, I returned to my office to compose a response to Vanessa regarding her potential relocation. After careful consideration, I wrote, "I've considered your job opportunity information and recognize this represents a significant professional development aligned with your rehabilitation focus. While geographical distance will necessitate adjustments to our current communication patterns, I believe appropriate accountability can be maintained through quarterly video conversations, continued financial transparency, and consistent demonstration of the responsibility you've shown during the past 3 years. Your decision should be based on legitimate professional development rather than concern about my perception of your commitment to ongoing restitution. I've reached a point in my recovery where my sense of security no longer depends on geographical proximity or direct observation of your choices. The structures we've established can be adapted to support both your continued rehabilitation and my ongoing well-being regardless of location. After sending the message, I felt unexpected lightness, recognition that my recovery had progressed beyond requiring external control to maintain inner security. This evolution represented perhaps the most significant aspect of post-betrayal: growth, the development of resilience based not on elimination of vulnerability, but on integration of experience into stronger, more flexible capacity for navigating complexity. 2 weeks later, after Vanessa had accepted the Seattle position and begun transition planning, we met for what would be our final in-person conversation before her relocation. We selected a small cafe equidistant from our respective residences, maintaining the neutral territory approach that had characterized our carefully structured reintroduction. "I want to express my appreciation for your response to this opportunity," Vanessa said after initial greetings. "I was prepared to decline if you felt it represented abandonment of accountability." 5 years ago, I might have interpreted it that way, I acknowledged. The work we've both done, separately and through facilitated communication, has created capacity for more nuanced understanding. Your consistent demonstration of change behavior has established sufficient evidence for me to distinguish between escaping responsibility and appropriate professional development. Vanessa nodded, her expression reflecting the self-awareness that had gradually replaced former defensive reactivity. The position involves developing financial recovery protocols, specifically for identity theft victims. The irony isn't lost on me that my understanding of harm caused might help prevent similar damage to others. There's potential meaning in that symmetry, I observed. Not redemption in the conventional sense, but transformation of destructive knowledge into constructive application. We discussed practical arrangements for maintaining appropriate connection after her relocation, quarterly video conversations, continued management of restitution payments through the established system, periodic updates on professional development, and recovery progress. These structures provided necessary boundaries while acknowledging the reality that our relationship, while permanently altered by past betrayal, had evolved beyond definition solely by that traumatic breach. "I've been working with my therapist on maintaining accountability independent of external monitoring," Vanessa explained. "The geographical distance will actually test whether the changes I've implemented have been internalized or merely performed for observation." Her insight reflected genuine psychological growth, recognition that meaningful rehabilitation requires development of internal guardrails rather than depending on external controls. Whether this understanding would translate consistently into behavior remained to be determined, but the awareness itself represented significant evolution from the entitlement mindset that had enabled her original betrayal. As our conversation concluded, Vanessa hesitated before asking, "Would it be appropriate to acknowledge the upcoming 5-year mark? Not to minimize what happened, but to recognize the journey since then?" The anniversary she referenced, 5 years since the discovery of her theft, approached in 3 weeks. I had been aware of the date's significance but uncertain how to relate to it. Her question offered opportunity to consider this milestone within the context of our evolving understanding. "I think acknowledgement is appropriate," I replied after consideration. "Not celebration, but recognition of the distance traveled from that point, your rehabilitation progress, my recovery development, the transformation of destructive patterns into more conscious choices." She nodded, relief visible in her expression. "I've been reflecting extensively on who I was then versus who I'm becoming now. Not to excuse what I did, but to understand the mindset that made those choices possible and ensure I never return to that perspective. That reflection itself represents significant growth, I acknowledged. The former version of yourself lacked capacity for that level of self-awareness. As we prepared to leave, Vanessa asked hesitantly, "Do you think we'll ever reach a point where what happened isn't the primary context of our relationship? Not forgetting or denying it, but not having it as the central defining reality?" I considered this question carefully, recognizing its complexity. I don't think we'll ever have the type of relationship that might have existed without that betrayal. The breach created permanent alteration in what's possible between us. But I do think we can continue developing connection based on present choices rather than past actions, limited by appropriate boundaries, but not solely defined by historical harm. This perspective, neither minimizing traumatic impact nor remaining permanently anchored in victimhood, represented the integration I had achieved through conscious recovery work. The betrayal would always be part of our shared history, but it need not determine all future possibilities if consistent demonstration of changed behavior continued to build foundation for appropriately boundaried connection. 6 months after Vanessa's relocation to Seattle, I stood before the board of directors at Horizon, presenting our 3-year strategic plan. The vision I outlined expanded our resilience-building methodologies beyond individual organizations to ecosystem-level transformation, strengthening entire service sectors through aligned approaches to mission fulfillment and adaptive capacity. The organizations that create lasting community impact aren't necessarily those with the most resources, I explained, but those that have developed capacity to transform challenges into opportunities for mission advancement. This capacity emerges not through avoidance of vulnerability, but through its conscious integration into stronger, more adaptive systems. As the board unanimously approved the strategic direction, I experienced profound alignment between personal, journey, and professional purpose. The betrayal that had once threatened everything I had built had ultimately led to development of frameworks that now strengthened entire communities, transforming individual trauma into collective resilience. Through conscious integration of painful experience into purposeful contribution. Later that evening, I received the latest restitution notification: Vanessa's consistent monthly payment transferred from her new position in Seattle. While the financial restoration remained important, its significance had evolved beyond monetary value to represent evidence of continued commitment to responsibility, regardless of geographical proximity or external monitoring. 5 years after discovering my sister's devastating betrayal, I had rebuilt financial security exceeding what had existed before, not merely through accumulation of resources, but through development of resilience based on integrated purpose, rather than defensive protection. The professional success I had achieved surpassed previous aspirations, not just in conventional metrics, but in meaningful contribution aligned with authentic values. Most significantly, I had discovered that genuine recovery involves not just restoring what was lost, but transforming the experience of loss itself into source of wisdom, strength, and purpose that would have remained inaccessible without the journey through devastation to reconstruction. This transformation, from surviving betrayal to creating meaning beyond survival, represented the most valuable outcome of a process that had begun with what appeared to be irreparable destruction. As I reviewed final preparations for an upcoming national institute based on the resilience methodologies developed through my recovery journey, I reflected on the evolution from victim to guide, from trauma to transformation, from protective isolation to purposeful contribution. The security I had once pursued through external achievements and protective measures had been revealed as ultimately insufficient. The resilience that had replaced it emerged through integration of vulnerability into stronger, more authentic identity, capable of meaningful connection despite past harm. This evolution continued to unfold through ongoing choices rather than reaching some permanent resolution. the distinction between conventional recovery narratives and the reality of transformative resilience I had discovered through conscious engagement with betrayal's aftermath. The journey wasn't about arriving at completion, but continuing to create meaning from experience that might otherwise have remained solely destructive. This understanding, that purpose emerges through integration rather than elimination of painful experience, now informed every aspect of my personal and professional development, transforming what had been taken into foundation for greater contribution than would have been possible without the devastating journey of loss and reconstruction. 7 years after discovering Vanessa's betrayal, I welcomed clients and colleagues to the inaugural National Resilience Institute, hosted in Philadelphia's Convention Center. The 3-day conference represented the culmination of methodologies developed through my personal recovery journey and refined through implementation across hundreds of organizations nationwide. Over 600 participants had gathered, nonprofit leaders, foundation representatives, financial professionals, and community advocates, to explore frameworks for transforming vulnerability into collaborative strength. Traditional approaches to organizational sustainability focus primarily on financial protection, I explained during my opening keynote address. While prudent financial management remains essential, true resilience emerges from integration rather than insulation, from developing capacity to transform disruption into opportunity through adaptive response aligned with core purpose. As I guided the audience through principles that had emerged directly from my post-betrayal reconstruction, I observed the profound symmetry between personal and professional evolution. What had begun as desperate attempt to rebuild individual security had gradually expanded into methodologies strengthening entire communities. This expansion, from personal recovery to collective resilience, represented the most meaningful outcome of a journey that had initially appeared solely destructive. Following the keynote, I participated in a featured dialogue with Dr. Eleanor Prescott, a leading researcher in organizational psychology whose work focused on post-traumatic growth in institutional contexts. Our conversation explored connections between individual and collective resilience, examining how personal recovery principles could be effectively translated into organizational methodologies. Your approach differs significantly from conventional risk management frameworks, Dr. Prescott observed. Rather than focusing exclusively on prevention, you emphasize transformation of inevitable disruption into catalyst for mission advancement. What inspired this distinctive perspective? The question created opportunity to acknowledge personal experience without disclosing specific circumstances. My understanding of resilience has been shaped by navigating significant personal setback that initially appeared devastating, I explained. Through that process, I discovered that genuine recovery involves not just restoring what was lost, but developing greater capacity through integration of challenging experience. The organizations that implement these methodologies most effectively share that fundamental insight, that disruption, while painful, contains potential for transformation when approached with intention and purpose. This measured transparency, acknowledging personal foundation without exploitative disclosure, reflected the balanced perspective I had developed regarding my recovery journey. The betrayal remained part of my history, informing my professional approach without defining my identity or requiring protective concealment. During the afternoon sessions, I observed presentations by organizational leaders who had implemented resilience frameworks developed through Horizons consulting practice. Their diverse applications, from community health initiatives to educational programs to environmental advocacy, demonstrated how methodologies emerging from personal recovery could strengthen mission fulfillment across multiple sectors and circumstances. The Institute's first day concluded with a reception where I encountered Marcus Reynolds, Executive Director of the National Foundation for Nonprofit Excellence, whose organization had recently adopted resilience-focused criteria for major funding initiatives. Our previous interactions had been limited to brief conversations at professional gatherings, but his interest in Horizon's methodologies had intensified following implementation of our approaches by several of his foundation's grantees. "The results we're seeing from organizations using your frameworks are remarkable," Marcus commented, as we found a relatively quiet corner amid the crowded reception. "Particularly impressive is how they're maintaining mission focus while developing financial adaptability. Typically, those objectives create tension rather than alignment." "That alignment represents the core insight of our approach," I explained. "When organizations clarify how financial decisions either enable or constrain mission fulfillment, they develop capacity to distinguish between security measures that support purpose and those that primarily serve psychological reassurance." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "We've observed that distinction consistently across implementing organizations. It's transformed our funding approach. We now evaluate proposals based on adaptive capacity rather than solely examining financial projections." Our conversation continued, exploring applications of resilience methodologies across the Foundation's portfolio. Marcus's analytical intelligence and evident commitment to strengthening nonprofit effectiveness created engaging dialogue that extended well beyond professional courtesy. As the reception concluded, he mentioned his plans to attend several specific sessions the following day, creating natural opportunity for continued conversation without imposing expectations. Upon returning to my hotel room that evening, I received a video call notification from Vanessa, our scheduled quarterly check-in. After establishing appropriate parameters through Dr. Marshall's facilitation, we had maintained consistent communication, following her relocation to Seattle 2 years earlier. These structured conversations provided opportunity to sustain appropriate connection while respecting permanent boundaries necessitated by past betrayal. "The Institute launch looks impressive," Vanessa commented after initial greetings, referring to social media coverage she had seen. 600 participants for an inaugural event represents significant validation of your methodologies." I nodded, noting her genuine recognition without obvious envy, a meaningful distinction from previous patterns. "The response has exceeded projections. Most encouraging is the diversity of participating organizations, from grassroots initiatives to national institutions representing multiple sectors and communities. I've been implementing similar principles in my work with identity theft recovery clients," she shared. "Not identical methodologies, obviously, but parallel insights about transformation rather than mere restoration, helping clients distinguish between security measures that enable purposeful engagement and those that primarily serve psychological protection." This application of recovery principles within her professional context represented appropriate integration of insights gained through rehabilitation. While the harm she had caused could never be erased, her development of expertise that benefited others facing similar violations demonstrated meaningful growth beyond performative remorse. Our conversation continued, covering her professional development at Collins Financial Recovery, where she had advanced to senior recovery specialist based on effectiveness with particularly complex identity theft cases. She maintained appropriate boundaries regarding personal information, respecting the limited nature of our relationship, while demonstrating continued commitment to rehabilitation through transparent communication and consistent restitution payments. Before concluding the call, Vanessa mentioned a development I hadn't anticipated. "I've been invited to contribute to a professional guidebook on identity theft recovery protocols," she explained. "The publishers are aware of my background, my complete background, and believe my perspective would strengthen the resource. I've declined to participate without your explicit approval, given that my expertise derives directly from harm I caused you." Her recognition of this ethical consideration, seeking permission rather than assuming entitlement to utilize experience gained through violation, demonstrated significant evolution from previous patterns. The request created complex considerations regarding appropriate boundaries between acknowledging rehabilitation progress and maintaining necessary accountability. "I appreciate your recognition of this consideration," I responded after thoughtful Pause. I need time to reflect on the implications before providing definitive response. What's your submission timeline? The initial outline isn't due for 6 weeks. There's no pressure for immediate decision. I wanted to raise the possibility for your consideration, rather than proceeding without explicit discussion. This approach, providing information without expectation of immediate accommodation, reflected continued growth in respecting appropriate boundaries. While complete trust could never be restored given the historical breach, her consistent demonstration of changed behavior provided foundation for measured evolution of limited relationship focused on present choices rather than permanently defined by past actions. After concluding the call, I considered the request within broader context of my 7-year recovery journey. The professional guidebook opportunity represented intersection of multiple considerations: Vanessa's rehabilitation progress, appropriate accountability for past harm, potential benefit to others facing similar violations, and my own continued evolution from self-protective survival to integrated purpose. The following morning, before the Institute's second day commenced, I received an unexpected message from my mother. The communication included photographs of documents she had discovered while organizing family records, financial papers revealing previously unknown aspects of my parents' early relationship. The materials demonstrated that my father, before abandoning our family, had systematically diverted educational funds established for both daughters, using the money to finance speculative investments that ultimately failed. I debated whether to share this information. My mother wrote, "There's no practical benefit at this point, but I believe understanding the full context of our family financial patterns might provide additional perspective on dynamics that contributed to what happened between you and Vanessa. This doesn't excuse her actions, but may help explain how intergenerational patterns established foundations for both your hyper-responsibility and her sense of entitlement." This revelation created unexpected context for family dynamics that had shaped both my sister's destructive choices and my response to their devastating impact. The patterns Vanessa had replicated, exploitation of trust, rationalization of financial violation, entitlement to resources not legitimately accessible, had been modeled by our father years before either of us could consciously recognize their influence. Similarly, my hypervigilant approach to financial security had developed partly in response to instability created by his actions, though I had channeled that vigilance through constructive rather than exploitative avenues. This expanded understanding didn't diminish accountability for conscious adult decisions, but provided systemic perspective on family patterns that had established unconscious foundations for those choices. The insight aligned with principles I had developed through both personal recovery and professional methodologies, that genuine resilience emerges from conscious integration of challenging experiences rather than isolated protection from their recurrence. As I prepared for the Institute's second-day sessions, I reflected on how this revelation intersected with current circumstances. Vanessa's professional development utilizing insights gained through rehabilitation, my expansion of recovery methodologies into frameworks benefiting entire communities, and our carefully calibrated relationship, maintaining appropriate boundaries while acknowledging continued evolution. The Institute's second day featured interactive workshops implementing resilience methodologies across diverse organizational contexts. During the lunch break, I encountered Marcus Reynolds again, and our conversation resumed with engaging exploration of how resilience frameworks could be integrated into foundation funding criteria without creating excessive compliance burdens for grantees. The challenge, Marcus observed, is distinguishing between meaningful resilience development and performative risk management that satisfies formal requirements without creating genuine adaptive capacity. That distinction represents a core insight of our approach, I agreed. Effective implementation requires fundamental shift from protection-focused to purpose-focused mindset, from avoiding vulnerability to transforming it into catalyst for mission advancement. Our discussion continued with such natural engagement that we barely noticed the lunch period concluding. As participants returned to afternoon sessions, Marcus hesitated briefly before asking, "Would you be interested in continuing this conversation over dinner? I'd value the opportunity to explore potential collaboration between your methodologies and our funding initiatives." The invitation created a moment of unexpected self-awareness. During 7 years of intensive recovery work, I had focused extensively on rebuilding financial security, professional purpose, and appropriate family boundaries. Relatively little attention had been directed toward developing new personal relationships, particularly those involving potential romantic dimension. While Marcus had framed the invitation professionally, the engaged quality of our interaction suggested possibility beyond strictly business discussion. "I'd enjoy that," I responded, surprising myself with immediate acceptance rather than default caution that had characterized post-betrayal interactions. "There's a restaurant near the convention center that would provide appropriate setting for continued conversation." This spontaneous openness to potential connection represented significant evolution in my recovery journey, from hypervigilant self-protection to measured engagement based on present circumstances rather than past trauma. The capacity to distinguish between legitimate vulnerabilities requiring awareness and defensive isolation, preventing meaningful connection, demonstrated integration I had achieved through consistent recovery work. During the Institute's afternoon sessions, I participated in a panel discussion examining connections between individual and organizational resilience. When asked about transferring personal recovery principles to institutional contexts, I shared insights that had emerged through my journey without disclosing specific circumstances. Effective resilience development requires distinguishing between protective measures that enable purposeful engagement and those that primarily serve psychological reassurance, I explained. This distinction proves equally relevant for individuals navigating personal setbacks and organizations addressing operational disruptions. The goal isn't elimination of vulnerability, but its transformation into foundation for authentic strength and meaningful contribution. This perspective, emerging directly from post-betrayal reconstruction, had become core principle of methodologies now strengthening hundreds of organizations nationwide. The expansion from personal survival to collective resilience represented the most meaningful outcome of a journey that had initially appeared solely destructive. Transformation of individual trauma into frameworks benefiting entire communities through conscious integration of challenging experience. That evening, dinner with Marcus evolved into engaging exploration of potential collaboration between Horizon's methodologies and his foundation's funding initiatives. His thoughtful analysis and evident commitment to strengthening nonprofit effectiveness created natural connection that gradually expanded beyond professional discussion to include personal background, values, and aspirations. "What initially attracted me to your approach," he shared, "was its integration of technical expertise with fundamental purpose. Most financial consultants address operational mechanics without connecting to organizational mission. Your frameworks consistently align financial decisions with core values in ways that strengthen rather than constrain impact." This observation identified precisely what distinguished my professional methodologies: integration of technical proficiency with purpose-driven application, directly reflecting transformation I had achieved through personal recovery. What had begun as desperate attempt to rebuild financial security had evolved into comprehensive approach to purposeful resilience, benefiting individuals and institutions across multiple contexts. As our conversation continued, I found myself surprisingly comfortable sharing selective aspects of my personal journey. The experience of rebuilding after significant financial setback, the transition from corporate achievement to purpose-driven enterprise, the development of methodologies